Hangout is live. Hello, everyone. I'm Christiana Ellis. I'm with,
No, I'm like, oh, sorry.
yes, that's all right. I'm with Mike Mateen, and this is Watching 100 Movies. Cue routine, traditional mention of how it's been a long time since the last episode. All right, that's done with now. We're here watching through the AFI's top 100 American films list, and it's been a long journey so far, and we've made our way to number 36 and 35, and we're going to talk about them tonight.
Yep. And not make any promises that we're going to start doing this more frequently or any of that kind of stuff. Although, as we always find every time we come back to it at this point, we're now into like the most fun of the movies to watch.
Oh, yeah. It's fun also, too, not only that there's a higher frequency of films where it's like, oh boy, I'm excited to watch that. But also there's fewer and fewer movies that we haven't seen already.
Yes.
There's a handful for each of us left that we haven't seen. But fewer and fewer as we go.
Yes. Yeah, it'll be primarily like rewatching in this context, which will be fun.
But so for tonight, we have number 36, The Bridge on the River Kwai, David Lean war movie from 1957, and Annie Hall, the Woody Allen comedy from 1977. Which we'll get to Annie Hall, but just on the subject of what we've seen or not. We had both seen Bridge on the River Kwai. I had seen Annie Hall, but you had not yet. But here we go now. So I guess without further ado, let's talk about Bridge on the River Kwai.
Yeah, let's do it. Is this our first David Lean movie?
I think so. We have Lawrence of Arabia still coming up. Dr. Zhivago is not on the list. I think it was on the previous list, but not the 10th anniversary one that updated.
Right. And African Queen's not David Lean, right?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's any other David Lean movies on the list. I think A Passage to India and Dr. Zhivago are the two others that I think are probably the most likely candidates that if they would be on the list. I actually haven't seen A Passage to India.
It's interesting. I mean, they're all it's the same. This one and Lawrence of Arabia are by far like the best ones. I mean, Dr. Zhivago is very, very good, but these are good for similar reasons in that they are character-driven movies that still have just expansive set locations and just beautiful cinematography and so it's a combination of the two things, but the story is not just residing on the fact that it's like looks really cool, and it's not just a play in a in a one set room, which makes it it's just the talent to be able to combine those things, and I think is why he's noted, even though he's only made 4 or 5 movies of note, and also why they're just so much fun to watch. Let's not kid ourselves. They're long, but the time flies. At least for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember this movie first becoming aware of it. Actually, it's one of the movies that way back when we were just kids, I remember you telling me about it, and it being one of the first movies I think. Because you were hip to the idea that older movies can still be good way before I was. And I feel like this was one of the first ones that you told me about as thinking was good. And I was like, but it's old. And I don't know that I fully appreciated it at the time, but I definitely have a memory of you telling me about it again, like way back when we were 8 or something like that.
Well, yeah, and I think that's part of what, when I talk about that combination of it is that, when I was 8, I did not, I understood, the character motivations. I didn't appreciate, some of the subtleties of it,
Mm-hmm.
and how and like the relationship between him and Saito, or Nicholson and Saito, and why it was such a and then and how like the juxtaposition between the American and Shears, and all of these, the way these guys all kind of interacted. I mean, I still liked it. And that's the thing, is it works on just that simple level of there's some action, there's some cool set pieces, and the story is interesting enough that an 8-year-old can still pay attention, and kind of get where it's going.
It's interesting because I can't help but think that at that age, the stuff that would have been the primary appeal is probably the stuff that I find maybe less interesting now compared to some of the other more complex, nuanced character work. Just the adventure of it and the setting and the action. You know what I mean?
Being in a place that I've only heard of and barely even heard of, and just to see this huge jungle, and it's these guys building a bridge, and there's commandos sneaking around, and, and they're going to blow up the bridge, and then they're not going to blow up the bridge. And he's going to blow up his own bridge in a dramatic way,
We actually have J. Scott Garibay in the chat asking, did either of you see Dunkirk? How would you compare Bridge to Dunkirk? I hadn't seen it. So I think, unfortunately, we're not able to make that comparison ourselves in this case. But thank you for asking a question.
No, and that, thinking back, that would have been a great, movie to kind of go see in comparison to this. But I'm glad to hear, I'm assuming that Jay's seen Dunkirk, and obviously I've heard good things about it. So it just more motivates me to even want to go see that movie when it comes out on,
I know that, at least based on my initial impression of it, I think of Dunkirk, like from what I understand of it from trailers and so on, it feels more in the vein of something like Saving Private Ryan, in the sense of more like a typical war movie, whereas Bridge on the River Kwai is really kind of a side story that is meant to be sort of metaphorical of the larger conflict rather than telling a story of the larger conflict. Right.
Well, see, I think I'd have a different understanding of Dunkirk, and that it is a side story. It's a very specific story about the way that this village came together as part of World War II, but it is not telling a World War II action, standard story. It's much outside the vein of your mainstream World War II stories. So that's my understanding, is actually that it would be very comparative to this.
Okay, well, that wasn't the impression I got from the trailer, but we're not here to talk about Dunkirk, especially given that neither of us have seen it. So the premise, obviously, of Bridge on the River Kwai, for anyone who hasn't seen that, is that we follow the story of first we have kind of two halves of the story that obviously cross over each other at various points, but we have the story of a British commanding officer and the men under his command who have been ordered to surrender to the Japanese during World War II. And they are now prisoners in this work camp. And in order to keep up the men's morale, he instructs them to actually try to maintain their discipline and their determination, and to do good work as a means of keeping up morale. And it becomes complex in terms of the negotiations between him and the commanding officer of the prison camp. And we'll obviously be talking a lot more about it. But then we also have the other half of the movie, which is the American who was a prisoner there but escaped, and then eventually ends up being part of a mission returning to the camp in order to blow up the bridge being built.
Right. And just because you did paint the part about, the British Commander Nicholson, and his, wanting to maintain this civility, this discipline, this order, this chain of command. But then also our American has been lying about who he is to get better treatment. He's really just a Navy midshipman or something that fell off of a boat.
Yeah.
And he's been pretending ever since he was in the camp to be an officer, and portraying himself more of like on the, what would be a modern day Navy SEAL officer, a commando officer, when really he has none of that, so he's basically a big fake, and so it's just, they're very different in their motivations and how they're treating their time, even though they both come into this camp as quote unquote officers and then leave for, various, so
yeah.
It really makes an interesting, because like when you were watching it earlier, before kind of processing it, watching it through this lens of being, on this list, I think that was lost on me. And not just when I was 8, I mean, even when I've seen it since then, of, that the cut back and forth wasn't just to tell us the two stories that eventually come together. It was to show these very different reactions to the war, basically, and to having been imprisoned, that are completely different, because the American one is much more chaotic and versus the British much more regimented.
Yeah.
And it makes it interesting as more interesting as they cross back and forth, and just, it's time to go tell this part now. And then we go back to the camp, then we go back to the American, like they actually, things that happen in each one sort of mirror each other in like a funhouse mirror kind of way. You know?
Well, that said, I think it's also quite possible to indulge in a little bit of a cynical portrayal of it, which is to say that one half of the movie is a nuanced character study and the other half of the movie is adventure travelogue, which, that's an overstatement. But so when I actually rewatched this a few months ago when I thought we were going to do this episode sooner than we ended up doing. And it had been a long time since I'd seen it when I watched it then. And during that rewatching, I found myself actually getting fairly impatient during those scenes, maybe just because I was so much more invested personally with, Nicholson's side of the story there in the prison camp, and especially the stuff at, drinking martinis on the beach with the pretty nurse. I just felt like, why this feels like a different movie. And that's in that previous watching. I went into watching it again just a couple of days ago, remembering that feeling and being prepared to feel the same way. And then in almost every one of those scenes, kind of still catching myself going, well, yeah, but I guess at least this part is well done. And, oh yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty interesting. And, oh yeah, well, okay, I guess that's okay. Well, I can see what they're doing there. And so I kind of swung both ways on how I felt about the William, Holden's Shears storyline when he's away from the prison camp.
Well, I feel like there's a couple things going on with that. I mean, I think it makes the Nicholson scenes better, because it's, even though it isn't just truly like a regular, action war movie adventure travel, it does have those aspects. So when you go to the other one, which is just them in the prison camp, and how they're relating to their capture and how they're, progress, how they're it's like the old, like it's very much by a very old storytelling methodology, and that there is this ascension, a climax, and then sort of a descension for the main character, because so he's like, everything's getting better and better and better for them, because as they build this bridge, and his relationship with Saito is getting good, but then you start to see these subtleties of like him being overtaken by the actual task of building the bridge for Saito, as opposed to it being about the morale of the men anymore.
Right.
And there's that turning point, and then he goes into that. It's fairly expedited, the dissension, but I think that catches you a little. I think that it comes on a little more slowly because it is interspersed with this other part of the movie that is more traditional. And then I also don't want to discount that. And I thought of this, but I know we cut our conversation about Dunkirk, but the last thing I was going to say when you said, well, hey, that's what the previews made me think. It's like, well, the previews are trying to sell you on going to the movie, and more people want to go see a big pretty action movie. So they kind of use that, hey, this is a more traditional action movie. That I don't know, because I wasn't around at the marketing of this, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of that, using William Holden, having that part in there, was to help market the movie, you know. And I think they didn't use it in a very effective way, but I'm not convinced that it wasn't a part of that, you know.
Well, the other thing that I'm reminded of when we discuss this is when we talked about the Treasure of Sierra Madre and how it has this bizarre sequence in it that feels now like it belongs in some other movie, or it's from Hollywood Trope Vault #3 or something like that, where the prospector character, who is the most sympathetic one at that moment, kind of goes off and he just finds this friendly village that's like all of these people who don't speak his language, and he gets honored like he's some pale ghost spirit or something, and he brings one of their kids back to life with CPR, and just it's this whole little interlude that feels like it's from a whole different story. And how some of those things, like, because in this movie, when Shears first escapes, he obviously has this harrowing adventure at first, but then he gets found by this little village. It's they're in Siam, correct?
Science. Well, it's Ceylon or something in the movie.
Ceylon. That's so. In any case, wherever he is, at this village, and they're friendly and they give him flower leis and stuff like that, and send him away on a boat. And at the same time, part of what redeems that sequence to my mind is the fact that when they come back in with the commando squad, that's when they actually address that, like, why those people would be inclined to help someone escaping the Japanese, and that it's not not enemy territory for him as an American, right? But just the idea that, okay, I got a little far afield from my real point, which was just to say the travelogue aspects of it were a bigger deal when this movie came out, because people weren't as familiar with seeing these then exotic locales. The jungle and Japan and, the Far East and all of these sorts of things were not something that you could just turn on and, Discovery Channel or Travel Channel and see these, beautiful jungle vistas, right? So the idea of wanting to show all of this landscape and highlight the adventure aspect of it was something that was more highly valued, I think, at the time that the movie was made.
Right. I agree. And but I also think that showcases some of what is so great about David Lean, is that, he used that opening scene, to not only do the thing that the studio probably wanted him to do, which was, show the other culture and show the landscapes. And he also used it to show how difficult it was going to be to get to where these guys were, and how really amazing it would be that for somebody to escape, which is also reinforces the idea of why they are not in an imprisonment, why they're just sort of let to run free, why it's not a walled in camp, and it's why, this is how hard it is to get out of there, and how deep in the jungle this is, which also is part of telling the story of, what drives Nicholson, somewhat mad, isn't just that he's imprisoned and that he's really proud of this bridge. There is the aspect of the jungle part of it. There's that heart of darkness, in a different way. That's part of why he's progressing like that. It's not as overt, which is, again, one of the things that is also so cool about this movie, is some of those subtleties, that there is a very, Joseph Conrad heart of darkness feel to what happens to Nicholson, but it isn't bold in that same overly dramatic, like, dark way. It's not really even dark. There is a dark aspect to what is happening to him, but it is also a pride, and it's also it's just,
and also, I mean, I think part of what in terms of it not being quite so dark is because as opposed to, Mr. Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, or of course, there's Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, which maybe more people know that adaptation. But I think as opposed to that type of character who has full on gone to the dark side and is, foundering in the abyss over there, I think what we see with Nicholson is approaching that and getting just to the edge and realizing with horror how far he's gone, as opposed to someone who is completely gone.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in that sense he more mirrors not the Kurtz aspect of it, but it's the Martin Sheen character and
Willard in Apocalypse Now, Marlowe in the original story.
Marlowe, yeah, it's more of the Marlowe character in that he starts off with these great intentions. It's this, but as as Marlowe gets deeper and deeper into the jungle, it affects him this way. Whereas, Nicholson is already deep into the jungle, and the events that happen within that are what are starting to move him along that path. So I see it as more of that, as opposed, and because that's exactly what happens to Marlowe and Willard, is that they come right to that brink and could easily join Kurtz and be a part of that, but they come back and catch it before they get too far,
Right. And I think what we see is that, Nicholson maybe pulls back at the very last moment, but not without help. You know what I mean? It took people dying around him for him to be able to reflect on that from his obsession. In the chat, I don't know whether to say Jay or Jay Scott, or he says, which group did you sympathize with more, the Allied soldiers working to detonate the bridge or the Allied soldiers working to keep the bridge intact? I feel like that's an interesting question, because on the one hand, in any sense where we have a sympathetic character like Nicholson, who I think we sympathize with. Oh, I just realized I had it set so it was always showing you. Oops. I think that even though we may find Nicholson sympathetic, even as it starts to turn a bit more, because he's definitely sympathetic for a long time at the beginning before it starts to turn a little bit darker. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like in my mind, it was always the right thing to destroy the bridge. And it's one thing for him to have the rationalizations for why it's okay to make the bridge, but those rationalizations become increasingly thin. And so by the time we're near the end, I'm very much on the side of blowing up the bridge. I don't know about you.
Well, that's almost exactly what I was going to say. Is I'm really glad they asked that question, because that is one of the underlying themes. When I've sort of talked generally about how they juxtapose the two stories. So in the beginning, it feels like you don't necessarily empathize or sympathize with, Shears and the Americans, because he just wants to drink martinis and hang out with chicks, and he doesn't care about any real he doesn't really have any cause or direction or priorities. He just wants to hang out, and he's lying about what he's doing. He's trying to get out of even going multiple times. He has no real conviction to it. Whereas Nicholson is all about conviction and order and morale and how are we going to get through this. And so, you're sympathizing, you're rooting for him. And you're like, this guy's kind of just a yahoo, not really.
Well, right.
As they progress, you start to, and as he becomes more devoted to the mission of going to blow up the bridge and getting those guys through it and being a part of that commando team, and and in some of those, there's really subtle things in there where it feels like just long periods of them just traveling across really tough things. But there's subtle conversations with him as he's basically norming it with a team. Whereas the Nicholson side, he's starting to go too far with his, his pride in the bridge and his relationship with this, commando who, while yes, he is sympathetic, which is why we accept that they have this relationship. But yet he is still a guy that kept a dude in a box for however long.
Yeah.
He doesn't exactly run it with sympathy, even though he does have a sympathetic side to him. And as they become more together and more working on the same, you start to, your sympathies start to shift until the end, when they kind of come together, and then you feel sympathetic for Nicholson again. And that's when he gets to save the day in a tragic way. you know? So I think that is one of that's why I say I love that question, because that is an underlying theme of this movie in a way that I feel like it is designed to make you feel, which is the idea is that this is very complex.
Mm-hmm.
You know, war has a lot of characters in it, a lot of normal people that act in very abnormal ways, and they can be used for good, which could get too far, or so
Yeah.
So
because,
yes, I feel the same way as you, but I've also thought about it a lot more, and so I have sort of
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the idea of the two characters sort of starting in opposite places, kind of crossing past each other in terms of their respective arcs, right? Because the first time we see Shears, which is right at the beginning, we haven't seen Nicholson yet. This is before the British soldiers have even come into camp, but we see Shears still at the camp, and he's basically been given gravedigger duty, and he finds a cigarette lighter on one of the bodies and bribes the guard to get into the sick tent. I mean, so that's his introduction to us, is him being a little bit sleazy. Now, like, we don't hold it against him too much, because obviously, he's he's under duress, right? But what we also see is, even as Nicholson comes in and is trying to maintain dignity and decorum and try to say, we're going to make the best of what our admittedly terrible situation, you have Shears, who's kind of the shirker, who is going to try to get out of any work he can and basically just say, look, rule of law, that's stupid. Why wouldn't you try to escape? Just because, your commanding officer said you had to, so you're going to just sit here? That seems stupid. And he's basically disrespecting.
Like, why are you going to listen to that guy? Like, I'm here chilling in the medical tent.
Yeah.
And that is locked in a tiny box. Like, which one of us is making the better decisions? Like, and I think that what you just talked about there, like how it paints him at the beginning, and like you even talked about with the martinis and the girl, and just pushing back from even going, the fact that he lied about being an officer. What I think is part of the genius of the characters of this story is that it is able to paint his negative characteristics without ever going so far that he is irredeemable. Like, he's never really like a bad guy. Like you said, it's always like, well, you can understand, like, he's under duress, and he has a perfectly good explanation. Like, hey, I didn't want to get tortured, and I thought officers would get better treatment, and these guys don't know whether I am or not. They found me in the water. So I just pretended to be an officer, and then it just kept going with it because I was half out of my mind when they found me, and I just sort of, that's what I did, and I got put in this really cool tent, and there's all these pretty nurses, and it's like, well, am I really going to say no now? And you're like, well, yeah, I guess you can kind of see, like, he's already there. Like, he didn't.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's extra fun about that, because on the one hand, we can also look at him and say, it's like, yeah, but you're getting good treatment under false pretenses here. And it's also, you could argue, it's a substantial disrespect to the actual officer who's, so you could say that, but what's also fun about it is how it's revealed as a trap, where as the British officers are basically surrounding him with this idea of, no, you're going to go back to this place and help us blow up the bridge. It's like, well, I don't want to do that. Well, yeah, but here's why we think you're critical, and we're absolutely insisting that it be you. And he's like, well, but the American chain of command would have to agree. And they're saying, like, yeah, we already talked to them. Well, okay, but yeah, see, okay, finally, I'll admit it, that I'm not really an officer, like I said. And they're like, oh yeah, we know.
Yeah, we're very well aware of who you are, yeah. And that's why you don't actually get in trouble for doing this.
Yeah, see, now it turns out that if you don't go with us, they don't have a reason to not throw you in prison for impersonating an officer, see? So, like, we'd like to save them the paperwork, and we'd like to blow up the bridge, so it would really help us all out if you would come. And just the reveal of, like, and you can see just the slow motion train wreck of him realizing that he's really going to have to do this is pretty great, actually.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, we see him, over the course of that mission, even though many aspects of that mission I think really do kind of like they're in there because of the adventure travelogue needs of movies like this at the time, which, are not unpleasant to watch, but it also just feels like they're a little bit less critical to what the movie is in some respects, because, or at least in less critical to what makes the movie great, I think.
Right.
They're not bad at all. In fact, I think they're, much better than the average movie of that type would have been at that time. But, things like, oh, turns out this town, like they're mad. They want to help because Saito took all their men for railroad workers. So it's only women that we have to be your, carry your packs and stuff, so yeah, we just want to, it wouldn't be sexy to have, half naked men carrying your bags, and bathing in waterfalls. And so, stuff like that. Again, it's like, it's not bad. It's just that part of the movie is fundamentally less interesting to me than the stuff going on with Nicholson. But I think it's also probably true, like you said, that cutting back and forth the way it does sets up a pacing with the Nicholson stuff that might not feel the same if we didn't have something to cut away to.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also allows time to pass. There's even just a plot necessity to it where it doesn't just feel like, and then we cut to a week later.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, hey, we show these guys doing extensive travel, and we show a little bit of redemption for William Holden's character as he joins this team, and then we throw some sexy natives, and then you come back and it's like, okay, some things have changed. We've made a lot of progress on the bridge because some time has passed,
Mm-hmm.
and it smoothens out that too. I mean, that is, there's a couple of these things that we've talked about
Mm-hmm.
that, just really, really make me in awe of the way that this story is told,
Right.
and the way that it utilizes all of those ingredients. It's like it feels like a great chef, but you starting with great ingredients, but just putting them together to make this just amazing dish. Like the way that it all flows together, and then, oh, well, yeah, this helps us pass time, but then also draws, a juxtaposition to this character, also slows down that narrative a little bit. So it kind of has a slow burn as we get to the end. And it's not just a story about his descent into darkness. Like, it's not just Apocalypse Now.
Right.
We have this other piece to it. And yeah, we throw some bones to the travel log and the, standard war stuff, but we use it in an effective way. And, and then we have these characters set off from completely different angles, and then have them not cross paths, but cross over in our minds as to who we are rooting for more at the end, and then come back together and both end up tragically killed for this mission, which makes you think, God, war sucks, which is sort of the whole like idea at the end of it,
Right.
And then I think we should, we've talked a lot about those pieces, and I think that on that together, but I'd like to talk about Saito at some point,
Oh, no question about it. I've in some ways been trying to lean more on the Shears stuff to begin with, just because, like I said, I don't want to ignore that half of the movie, but believe me, I am all about talking more about Nicholson and Saito and all that half of the movie more. But before we, move completely away from Shears and his subplot, I think, even though there are a handful of,
I hesitate to call it a subplot. I think it's
but
half of the plot.
Yeah, but at the same time, almost all of those components of that half of the plot are much more kind of stock. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the young soldier who's not sure if he can really kill someone, and then finally does in the critical moment. And like, I'm not saying that stuff doesn't work, but it also feels much more like it was a stock character even at the time.
Yeah. I agree. I think, and like I said, I think it's by design to make the other half of the plot that much more dramatic.
I'm not sure I agree there, but I will agree that, like I said, my previous rewatch, I found myself impatient with this half of the movie, just in the sense of feeling like it was distracting from the half that was much better to my mind. I was less impatient this most recent rewatching. That said, of the two halves, I still definitely know which one I find more interesting. It's not to say that I think we could do without the Shears half, but I definitely like the other half better.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I actually like the other half better too. And I'm not, and I said at the beginning, like I'm not obtuse to the idea that some of this stuff is in there because there are studio requirements, there's marketing requirements, there's just sort of like, this is what you have to do. But I give it a little bit more credit and feel it is part of the genius of the movie. And I keep using this term, but it is really the perfect term for how I feel what these are, is there's a juxtaposition there. It's almost like David Lean's saying, like, this is what you think of in a war movie, is this thread.
Mm-hmm.
This is what really can happen in war. And like, this is the story they haven't told you. And that's why it's so much more interesting, because it's like a different way of telling the story. And so he's got these two channels of like what he's trying to tell, and the way that they cross back and forth and they move our sympathies back and forth makes the Nicholson thing the more interesting, because it is the different, it's the unique one. But I don't feel like it was all pandering. I mean, I feel like it's almost, if it was a requirement, and I feel like it was almost like Lean saying, you know what, if I got to put this in here, I'm going to absolutely use this to make this a better movie because I have to have this in here. Well, as opposed to just ticking off boxes, even though I'm going to tick off all the boxes. You know? Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think what's clear is even when maybe I complain about pieces of it, like the idea of David Lean pandering to those sorts of things is a different story than a hack director pandering. You know what I mean? Like, he panders better. Yes. But the other element of that too, that I think is a little bit more intangible, but we've talked already, I think, because it keeps coming up, and we haven't even talked about Casablanca as a movie on the list yet, because it's way up near the top. It's number 1, I think, actually, isn't it?
I got lots to say about that. So
anyway, though, no, it's not number 1. It's actually 3. But the point, though, is the reason I mention it is just because the anecdote about that is how it really wasn't expected to be, when it was made, this epic thing that was going to be one of the greatest movies of all time. It was just kind of, it was another studio picture for a studio that was cranking them out. Like, it was like 9 or 10 of them a year or something like that, each studio. Yeah. More than that, actually, now that I think about it. But the point is that sometimes the chemistry all comes together just right. And so
lightning in a bottle, as
right. And so in this context, I feel like even if the Shears half of the story compared to the Nicholson half of the story is not as good, and so sometimes I'm impatient with it because I want to get back to the Nicholson side, I think it is probably true, like you said, that the chemistry of the whole mix is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yes. Yeah, I think that we are definitely in agreement with that. I think many of our discussion has just been as to what level or necessity of all that. But yeah, I think we both agree that had it just been the story of the Nicholson thing, it would have very much felt like Apocalypse Now, maybe not as, not the visually.
It would have been a much more claustrophobic story.
Right. And it would have felt like they took Heart of Darkness and put it into a World War II war movie, kind of like Apocalypse Now took Heart of Darkness and put it in a Vietnam movie. Like, that's what Nicholson's story would have felt like on its own, because it would have only been that progression. So regardless of what you think the motivations of Lean or the studio or how this works or the subtleties of it, like, even just introducing this other part and splitting away and letting it slow burn absolutely had an effect. I happen to think there was more work, but I guess you came to that too. It's all the sum of the better,
right,
than the sum of the parts. Yeah. So yes, but now on to diving into the more interesting side.
Yeah. So, in the context of Saito specifically, we have another question in the chat here. How do you think Bridge did in presenting the Axis soldiers? Were they humanized or overly treated as villains? So I'll put that to you, having specifically brought up Saito earlier.
I'm going to go with neither of those, but I'll explain. They are not humanized, I don't believe. But they are not necessarily portrayed as villains. They are more of a prop stock character, like almost like stormtroopers, you know? Like they're like a thing that has to be there to tell the story. There have to be Japanese guys there, you know, in the camp. So they're not humanized by any means because they don't really have any characters. They don't have any character development. They're really there to either get punished by Saito or just to explain something that needs to happen or kill escapees or, you know, but so there's no character to any of them. But they are not bad. They are just they're literally props, and that sounds terrible, but that's how I feel about how they were put in the movie, is just human props.
I agree, and in fact, actually, I think a key example of that, you know, I mentioned earlier that
we don't even know any of their names, you know.
Well, right, yeah, and so I think in one of those stock subplots that we had over on the Shears side, the young soldier who doesn't know if he can do it, you know, we see him when he's training with the knife thing, and there's the whole mix up where he's attacking Shears, but Shears didn't know his training, blah 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 blah. Anyway, I don't want to over dismiss that, but the point is though that we have the midpoint of that arc where he is face to face with a Japanese soldier and hesitates, and Shears steps in and kills him instead, and it's a plot point for that character, but the Japanese soldier in that shot is portrayed as young and perhaps innocent, and we see that he had a photo of his family and stuff like that, which in some ways it's like
it's still a prop, you know.
Right. Well, that's actually what I was going to say, is that he is humanized only to make a point for the American or the British soldiers' storyline. So he is a prop for the British soldier realizing, oh, maybe they're not all just monsters. But he is not really humanized as a character at all. He is only meant to be a prop of enemy soldier who's maybe not really that bad, as opposed to enemy soldier who's a monster and must be destroyed.
Right. And it's the same thing with the soldiers that, you know, make a mistake, and there's they're crying because they've been berated and they're worried about whether or not their crime was enough to have to commit the suicide and all that. They're not a real character though. Like yes, you have a sympathy that happened, but that is, again, it's a prop to show you. It's meant to just kind of exemplify the difference in the Japanese chain of command and reward punishment system, and and Saito's complexities, as opposed to it's really about this guy who made this mistake and now he's got to be punished. That, yes, he's human in that you are sad for him, that he's being punished and in trouble and all that, but he's not a character. We don't know his name, we don't know anything about him. It's just it's a prop to tell the rest of the story.
Right, and especially since the whole premise of that is this setup that, in a very similar way to that other example, it is a way to show us, the viewer, that, the British engineers are actually better than the Japanese engineers. And the way to do that is to have them say, well, look, they're building the bridge in the wrong place. There's no river floor here. You know what I would do is do it over there. And that is a great plot point in the progression of the Nicholson storyline, and this idea of well, are you really helping, or are you just what's really going on there? But it's also, they are used as a way to show that the British are actually better and making a decision to proactively help.
Right.
Yeah. So it's kind of the implication, there's sort of the unspoken implication that, well, obviously the British engineers would be better, but do they say something? And because they did, that's the next step in that plot line, which is a good plot, but the Japanese engineers who get punished and where it's unclear whether they will be expected to kill themselves, they become kind of just a prop in that sense. So yeah, I think, to echo what you said, with the exception of Saito, every other Japanese character is essentially a prop used to support some beat of one of the British or American characters.
Yes. But now to Saito, I think that he does have a well-defined character that is complex. And I find it, again, some of it is probably a little bit of jingoistic, but he's like a little bit more the opposite of those guys. Like, he has sympathetic tendencies, but I am not sympathetic 100% to him. Like how the other guys have like some negative tendencies, but yet we are more sympathetic to them. I find myself, I feel like the movie is telling us, like, yeah, like, and I think they sort of try to excuse it with like, oh, well, he has to be like that because otherwise he has to kill himself, and that's sort of they sort of throw that thing out there a couple of times. So maybe they were trying to make him more sympathetic, but I still feel like, he does run and command this prison camp in a pretty harsh way and is choosing to do some things that, are, well, as we've, again, they try to simplify it with, oh, well, I have to get the bridge done, as to why he's going against the, war crimes commissions and like all these things that like Nicholson's throwing at him at the beginning, and why he's mistreating all these people and why there are so many grave diggings and all that. Like, that there's a really nasty aspect to that.
Yeah.
And, and I don't ever feel like they never try to paint, the movie never tries to paint the picture that the jungle did it to him. So, I have heard that argument from people before and say, well, it's the same reason that Nicholson was going dark. Like, he's just been in the jungle longer. And it's like, the movie never opens that door. It doesn't mean that that's not, if that was a real thing that was happening, that wouldn't be part of the reason. But that is not part of this universe. Like, that is never addressed.
Right. What I get from Saito is a character whose ambitions and expectations for himself have not been met, and he is beginning to fear that they won't, because he's actually not good enough to do it.
Yes, and that's a great way to put it, is that he operates out of this fear, and that's where those scenes of him crying, like, why they are, yes, he is human and you're sad that he's crying, but I never get as sympathetic with him, and I feel like the movie doesn't want me to be. Because he's scared, and so he has to make decisions he doesn't want to make because he's a sad, scared man.
Right. I think that he is fascinating as a very human, complex, nuanced character, which is not the same quite as being sympathetic, because we can understand, for example, why someone in the position that he's in is having to make difficult choices, including some that maybe he himself is not entirely comfortable with. But we can also recognize that, first of all, having trouble building this bridge in time, well, like, not my problem, dude. Right? It's like, you got yourself into this situation. It is not the prisoner's job to make sure that you can build the bridge in the time that you promised your boss you could.
Right.
That said, I think it's one of those things where it seems really clear that there's no way that this prison labor camp is a prestigious position, right? So I think part of what's interesting is a parallel between Saito and Nicholson, is that just like how Nicholson and his company, they weren't defeated, they were ordered to surrender, and did, because that's what the chain of command told them to do. And you can see how Nicholson, that stings, and yet he feels that his duty as a soldier is to follow the chain of command, and that is more important than this idea of having to, swallow his pride at the idea of surrendering. So he focuses all of his pride into trying to do the best job he can at being a model prisoner, so to speak.
Right.
And keeping the men up and understanding how they're going to be feeling and doing what he can to keep their mind off of it, and clinging so hard to the rule of law and order and discipline and morale and all of these things, trying to pretend he's still just a soldier instead of a slave. And he actually phrases it like that. Well, I think Saito in some ways has the same thing going on, is that he's all about this, like, oh, the Bushido, the code of the warrior and the honor and all of that. And yet, what's he doing? He's in charge of this prison camp where, like, he's supposed to build a bridge out in the middle of the jungle, and nobody cares about him out there. And, they care that he gets the bridge built on time. Otherwise, they could care less what goes on there. And he's probably not very well respected. We don't get the impression that he is. And so he's got to be feeling in this place like, the literally only chance for me to try to maintain any semblance of this person that I thought that I was trying to be is to do a good job and get this bridge done. And he's having to increasingly cross more and more lines to do it. And while we can understand his motivations and think of them as very human, there's a body count associated with that. And I don't think we can, it's not fair to the people who died under his leadership to ignore that and call him sympathetic or make excuses for him.
Exactly.
But he's a fascinating character for sure.
Oh yeah.
It's played by I'm not sure I'm going to be pronouncing this right, but Sesui Hayakawa, who apparently was a character actor who had done a lot of work already in both Japanese and American movies, and he was apparently 68 years old in this movie.
Wow,
which is bananas because he looks 20 years younger than that.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah, but Saito, I think, is a fascinating character, and it's especially given we get him going through these various phases as his relationship with Nicholson evolves, because he's the martinet at the beginning of, like, stands up on his box up straight and has his whole speech of, be happy in your work and that sort of thing, and taking no guff whatsoever from Nicholson, or not listening to him at all. Oh, here, I'll take your copy of the Geneva Convention and hit you in the face with it. Which, according to the trivia on IMDb, at least, which we know is, at least take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. Apparently, it was an accident that he actually hit Alec Guinness, really drawing blood in that shot that's used in the movie. And it wasn't an effect, because it was actually hit him. I didn't rewatch it to see how believable I think that is, but that's what the trivia said. But in any event, but then later when we see him realizing that this isn't working, I'm not getting the work done that I need, I have to compromise, but still trying to maintain the power in that relationship. So he pulls out the whole thing where, like, oh, hey, look, Nicholson, I speak English. I eat prime rib. I drink whiskey. I know I studied in London. Here's why you should work with me and help me make this work. But basically, Nicholson, by virtue of having been willing to sit in a metal box in the Ceylon sun for weeks at that point, right?
I got to correct that. It was filmed in Ceylon. It actually takes place in
Myanmar. Okay. But in any event, the Nicholson, by virtue of having been willing to sit in there all that time when he could have at any time.
Was in Ceylon sun.
Yeah. Well, so
sorry, I've derailed that. Go ahead. Yes.
But in any event, so because he was willing to sit in there, he could have come out at any time just by willing to concede of saying, first of all, I want to touch back on the sticking point there. I want to come back to that in a minute. But being brought out of that, Nicholson is basically, as long as he can maintain the strength and not cave in his position, he kind of has all the power there, because by bringing him out and trying to kind of negotiate and bribe with him like that, Saito has now revealed to Nicholson, oh, you need this. If you really didn't care, you'd just let me die in that box because it wouldn't matter to you. So now that I know you actually need it, all I have to do is stick it out until you cave.
Well, I think that's the realization that, so there's sort of the turning point in that scene where he's refusing everything and he's still being very like stoic with it and, trying to hold off. And then eventually, he just like stands up and just starts chugging the whiskey. It's like, that's kind of his, like, he's hit that point and realized, oh, I get it now. Like, I just have to hold out in there until I can get what I want because you need this. So I'm going to drink your whiskey, feel good for a little bit. And I'm going to go back in that damn box, and he doesn't say all those things, but like, that's what that means, and it's exactly what you're saying. Like Nicholson absolutely, at least I feel like that's what that meant because, he's so refusing everything. Like, no, I'm not, I don't want to accept that. I don't want to accept that. But then he has that glass of whiskey poured and he just gets up and he's just kind of, they're still talking. Like it is not like the end of the meeting quite yet, but you can see where it's going.
Yeah.
And he starts chugging the whiskey, like, oh, I get it. He realizes now that he's in control of this.
Yeah. It's pretty great. And so we have, this evolution, of, Saito gradually realizing he's going to have to cave, but feeling that humiliation there and trying to struggle for some way to, save face in that situation of like, how can he go back on what he said? So the difficulty of like, you got to give me something so that I don't have to be embarrassed by giving you what you wanted. And yet, like, that's kind of, everybody knows what that's the real situation. And so that's why, once, we finally have the point of giving Nicholson what he wanted and everybody, all the British soldiers cheer and Saito goes in and, they have, I think, he cries after the meeting later, right? But
no, he cries after the meeting later. Yeah. So what ends up happening? Like, so he goes back in the box, and he brings him out again, and he has created this like artifice of like it's the 100th anniversary of like some just like literally random date, and it's like so manufactured. He's like, and in honor of this great date, you officers don't have to work. And so he's basically saying, like, I had to say something. I had to make something in my mind. And then and then Nicholson leaves after that one, and that's when they surround him. They're picking up on his shoulders, and he's watching, like, basically what he wishes he was as a leader. And he's realized I had to invent a bullshit date to even make myself feel okay about doing this. Like, I'm a sad leader. I'm a terrible leader. And then he goes and he starts weeping. And again, you're sympathetic to him, but you're also like, yeah, you were a shitty leader. That's why you ended up in this position.
Yeah.
And because like you said, like you would take it a step back and you were probably a crappy leader to begin with, which is why you ended up running a base in the middle of nowhere or a prison camp in the middle of nowhere that doesn't even need walls because it's nowhere near anything.
Yeah.
That's why you got that post. And now you suck at that too. And yeah, we feel bad because we feel bad for people who like don't achieve things, and are sad about it. But you did also have a long time to get yourself in a position to not be like this, and you did not respond the same way that Nicholson did, when he was given a dealt a bad hand,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
so the I want to touch on that central point of dispute between them. The idea that officers having to do manual labor or not. And I understand that I think we can read between the lines and understand that part of it is just the principle of the thing, because the code says something. The Geneva Convention says a specific rule, and you have to follow the rules, and it's the principle of the thing. And I also can say we can glean from thinking about it that it's more about the idea that the British officers are supposed to allowed to have these, supervisory roles as opposed to just not doing anything. But at the same time, it just feels weird every time I watch it, the idea that the whole thing is about how, well, fancy officers shouldn't have to work. And I know that that's not quite the situation, but that's how they say it.
It is how they say it, and I feel like, so for me, it always felt like part of the progression of it. Mm-hmm. Like, it felt like at the beginning that it was a thing to say because it was a rule and it was just a way to be like defiant. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the concoction of like maintaining all of this order and like command and all that kind of stuff was the original principle. Mm-hmm. It was like, I know that you can't make us do this, so I'm going to take a stand. So yeah, it's part of his character is to be sort of defiant in that role because he was unhappy that he was captured. So he's standing up for this thing because it's a thing. Mm-hmm. And so they're very focused on like the rule, and it's like, yeah, officers don't do manual labor, and that's why they don't describe it as we should be running this project and supervising it. Mm-hmm. But that's part of the progression of what happens is that by then turning it over, by the way that it ends up happening, that they are not just like not made to do manual labor, that they are put in a position of actually like commanding the men. Mm-hmm. They then take that to, well, then we should be commanding the project, and we have better ideas for the project. Mm-hmm. And and now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, that's a little different. Like, you could have maintained the order and the discipline and still built the bridge in the wrong place that would have crashed the train mm-hmm. had it gone over it. But you taken it to this next step of like, well, now we have to prove that we're actually better at this. And so I think that's more of what it was, as opposed to like them just saying the British are better than the Japanese at bridge building. It was that they needed a way for them to like have to take a stand and say, oh, well, we're better at this, and so we're going to take this over. And it gets that snowball going of them mm-hmm. owning the project that is actually really for the Japanese military.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you, but I think that was kind of part of my point earlier about the Japanese engineers, in the sense that the simplistic element of the implication being the British engineers are better. I mean, it's all still just a part of the point that the Japanese engineers are just a prop for showcasing that story beat.
Right. They needed that escalation of their ownership of the project.
Yeah. Right. This idea that we recognize that there's something the Japanese engineers are doing wrong. Do we say so? Because that is taking a step towards proactively helping instead of just doing what we're told. Because if we don't help, if we don't say so, it'll just continue to build where it is, and it won't be good. And it's fascinating. And I think, we talked a little bit about the idea of the movie, this microcosm side story being sort of metaphorical of the overall war, is how, like Nicholson's arc is all about how good, reasonable goals and intentions and honorable things were his motivation, but by clinging to those so rigidly in an attempt to avoid despair, you can lose the ability to recognize when your behavior has become about, words rather than people.
Yeah.
I don't know if I said that very clearly, but
I get where you're going with it. Yeah.
Yeah, just the idea that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, what it reminds me of is just sort of a thought experiment that I remember you mentioning once, I think, on talking about Survivor, the idea that in terms of people and how they approach problem solving, there are some people who the very first thing that they come up with as an approach to solve the problem, they will just keep trying to do that until it works, convinced that that's the right way to do it, and can keep at it long past the idea that like if they had just given up on that and tried something else, they would have finished a long time ago. But because they're so determined to prove that their first idea is a suitable way to do it, that they just keep at it to a point of madness. And so this idea that maintaining the men's morale and their discipline, and also showing the Japanese that, like, if we show how good we are, that's a way to keep my men being treated well. But overall, it ends up completely losing the perspective of why are any of you even here in the jungle right now?
Right.
And having that all become part of this bigger war narrative of how surreal things related to war can be, in the sense that, on the one hand, things like diplomacy and protocol can sometimes feel absurd and almost even monstrous in the context of, why are you being so nice to that guy who represents the country that's killing our people? But on the other hand, if you don't have someone willing to do that, the killing just continues longer.
Right.
And so you have that constant tension of, it's not monstrous to want to ensure that your people are treated well, and to try to find a way to ensure your people are treated well is a good motivation. But where does it cross that line? And realizing how invisible that line can become when you're on the ground is, I think, kind of the story that's being told here, right? It's Nicholson starting from a good focus in a difficult situation, clinging to this safety line that he has created that seems like it's working, right up until the point where he just realizes, oh crap, my fellow countrymen are getting killed around me, and I have been trying to help the enemy in order to protect their bridge.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, I think that there's also that like subtle like symbolism that's put in there of them, they're tacking up the built by whatever regiment they are,
mm-hmm.
or whatever, and and they've got this sort of this really positive motivation for putting that sign there, and it's like someday the war will be over and we're going to build this bridge, will stand for 600 years. And we want everybody that comes down this bridge in the middle of fucking nowhere. Like, let's remember, like, that's another one of the things, again, those subtleties of like making sure to draw that connection that like they are in the heart of the jungle. Like,
yeah,
this is not going to be like a tourist like railroad in the future. Like, this is literally just to get the Japanese troops and guns and stuff up and down the east part of Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
But they've got this idea in their head that like, oh, then everybody that comes and travels down this beautiful bridge will know that the British soldiers built it, and that's why they put that thing up. But what they're basically trying to do, what it's symbolically saying is like, no, this is my bridge, not the enemy's bridge. But and while that is ambitious, the fact is, no, it is still the enemy's bridge, and it is still going to transport things that are going to all the death around you now. This bridge you built is going to bring more death to your people, like that, and that's what he like by putting that up there. He's like disconnecting himself from what that means.
Yeah,
You know, by having this sort of like, and yeah, in the moment it feels really good because you're like, yeah, that's really cool. Like everybody that travels down that bridge, but then the kid, you take that step back and you're like, nobody's going on this bridge. Like this bridge is literally just meant to transport guns and troops.
Yeah, and I think another part of the impulse is this desire that I think is very human, to want to follow a creative impulse to counter all of the destruction going on in the war, right? Mm-hmm. And like, as long as you can sort of ignore the part about how the bridge will be used, the idea of building something and building it well and showing how good your men are and how you can work together as a team, and like all of that is positive stuff, except that the end result is a bridge that the enemy is going to use for the enemy's purposes.
Right.
And so it's like, I think it's fascinating. And I think that the character, I want to say Clifton, the medical officer, is
one guy who's always like super resistant to the whole thing.
Because I think he's the one that is our like mile marker, so to speak, on Nicholson's journey, right? He's the one that is kind of remaining in a stationary point so that he can watch Nicholson go by, and we track his progress. Cutie little dog there. We can watch Nicholson kind of, watching him make his moral journey relative to Clifton, which helps to make it really clear, communicated by the movie, what we're supposed to be feeling about the various situation. And so we talked a little bit about the whole idea of whether officers should work or not, but another thing that is important about having something like that be the sticking point early on is to make it all the more dramatic when Nicholson himself says, we're not going to finish the bridge in time, so I've asked the officers to help work. And Clifton's like, wait a minute, wasn't that the whole point of, okay, all right, oh, okay. And then, initially one of the things that Shears had told them about Saito and warning them before he escaped is like, he's going to make people in the sick tent work. People are going to die because they're forced to, work even when they're sick or injured. And that was like a horrible thing. And then later we have him, Nicholson walking into the sick tent. It's like, okay, but how injured are you really? Are you sure? Come on, I'm sure you could help out. Just light work. And at that point, we have Clifton kind of, not wanting to disobey, but really kind of wanting to go on record as saying, what is the point here? Well, and being our stationary frame of reference to showcase Nicholson's changing reference.
No, you're absolutely right. Like he's great. He's a perfect character for that. Like he's definitely like our lens into it. But he highlights a couple things that we've talked about a little bit. But it's the idea that it was never about like whether or not the officers work. It was about being defiant and like standing for something that then became a thing to stand behind. Like that's not what. But then also this and the other piece, that little sequence right there is the argument that people have used that when I've talked about, the Saito thing of saying like, no, it's that like Saito is sympathetic because like his whole thing is that he's been in the situation too long, is that you see Nicholson starting to make the decisions that Saito would make. And so he's becoming Saito, but he through, as you said, help never makes that transition. And that, I still feel like that's like a little specious. Like that's the movie never. I don't feel like it draws that connection. I think it's still more about Nicholson and like, like he's starting to make decisions that are, really hard. Like he seems extra devoted to making this deadline in a way that is unnecessary, as opposed to like he's becoming Saito. You know, and that must have been what Saito went down. I think that and I don't want to get too much more into Saito because I think we kind of covered him. But this is the little micro sequence that has caught that I get that argument. You know.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's an interesting discussion to have and worth discussing the idea. And I mean, we kind of covered it, but I mean, I think just like we can be sympathetic with Nicholson throughout his journey and still think he's wrong, and he recognizes it at the end. You know, like I think in some ways it can be down to struggling with the language of it and saying, well, do we mean that Saito is sympathetic, or do we just mean that he is behaving according to understandable human emotions? Because we can understand and empathize with his frustration and desperation without saying, well, he had a point. You know, it's like, I think he is a complex villain for sure. But I don't think that there's really any point that we are allowed to see in this story of showing the good man that Saito was before he became the guy who works soldiers to death.
Right. Whereas all we have on his background is I studied in London.
Right. So we can understand that he's in a tough spot and he behaves like a human being, but he is also a human being that has done some awful stuff and intends to do more, and literally only through kind of ideological bullying from Nicholson ends up getting anything. And at the same time that happens, it's like a defeat for him in the sense that if by giving Nicholson everything that he wants being the only way to get the bridge built, that's kind of like saying, well, it's really Nicholson's bridge, which is, of course, Nicholson's point too, right? Like that's the whole thing. And Saito totally understands that dynamic of the more you take this on and succeed where I was failing before is your victory and my defeat, but only in this microcosm of the prison camp, because in the larger context of the war, my side still gets its bridge, which is all anybody else outside this camp cares about.
Right. At some point, yeah, like results end up being all that matters. You know, the ends, it doesn't matter what the means were.
So yeah, having Nicholson get to this gradual point of everything being about protecting his men, and then becoming kind of a pissing contest, highbrow one because he's British, pissing contest with Saito, to the point where he is actually working his own men sick and injured, and the officers too, to finish this bridge on time to prove a point, is this fascinating journey that I think is what I think is the greatest thing about this movie.
Yes.
And Alec Guinness is amazing.
Oh yeah. I mean, in all of the arguments that I was making earlier, to essentially paint the picture that as you said, the sum is greater than all of the parts. Like yes, I feel like all of the other parts of the movie support this, but Alec Guinness's character's, development is absolutely the most interesting and absolutely unbelievable part of this movie. Like to watch him go through that, to notice the point, like, because I think everybody detaches from him at like kind of a different point. And yeah, Clifton kind of is our reminder, is like, hey, by the way, if you haven't gotten off this ship yet, maybe you should. Like, I know he seemed really cool at the beginning, but he's not now. And that's why Clifton keeps coming in, like, and everybody sort of, I think everybody who watches leaves at a different point or starts to shift away at a different point. But that's where that constant, as you called him, the mile marker comes in. Like, at which mile do you get off the train? You know? And eventually it just like starts to pick up so much steam that you're like, wow, he's now the villain? Question mark? You know, like,
as Alec Guinness himself would say in another movie, it all depends greatly on one's own point of view. Just to touch on Clifton again, because he's a minor character, except for fulfilling that sort of vital story role as a marker for Nicholson. But I love just increasingly how passive aggressive he is about the stuff he's saying, and he's just like, so it seems like some people might call it, aiding
treason?
the enemy, almost even treasonous. I mean, I wouldn't say that, but I'm just saying, people might say so. And and then later, just before the final conflict, he's kind of like, yeah, I think I'm just gonna watch from up on the hill. And Nichols, you get a much better view from down here on the bridge. And he's like, yeah, I kind of just don't feel like being a part of it. Kind of. And I just love how he just sort of gently passive aggressive he is about saying, you've become a monster and this bridge is a structure of lies. So he gets the final line of the movie, though. He gets to say madness 3 times. And do a little bit of Charlton Heston style grimacing at the camera. Which
it does feel very like Planet of the Apes. Like,
yeah. Especially since it's not really obvious from context precisely what he means, because it's not clear how much of what just happened he would have really been able to see, other than the fact that the bridge blew up and walking down and seeing people dead. But it's like, how much of that was he aware of? Now, at the same time, I think we, allow some.
He's meant to be us, so
yeah, exactly.
We have to like assume that he's seen everything we've seen.
Yeah, that's how it's portrayed. So
I think he wants to go outside. He's asking nicely.
Oh, okay.
High five. High five. Yeah. I'm gonna take him out real quick. I'm just gonna open the door.
That's all right. So I will talk a little bit about the awards that this movie won while you do that. Okay. Excuse me. So The Bridge on the River Kwai came out in 1957, and it was Sisue Hayakawa, who played Saito, as we previously mentioned, was nominated for the Best Supporting Actor, but didn't win. But the movie won a lot of awards. It won Best Picture. It won Best Actor in a Leading Role for Alec Guinness. It won Best Director for David Lean. It won Best Writing Screenplay, Adapted Screenplay, which we want to come back to briefly in a little bit. It won Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, and Best Music Scoring, which was kind of notable because apparently compared to the time frame in which most movies are scored, this one was kind of a last minute, like done super fast sort of situation where they just had to do it all at the last minute. But one of the things that we want to note about the Best Screenplay winning is that the credited winners for that as the writers of the screenplay in as we look at it now, Pierre Boulez, Carl Foreman, and Michael Wilson. Pierre Boulez is the author of the book that this was based on. Didn't speak English, did not write any of the script, but he was the one that was announced as the winner of the Best Screenplay because Carl Foreman and Michael Wilson had been blacklisted at the time in 1957-58. And the studio and the Academy didn't want to give him credit because they were suspected of being associated with communists. They, however,
I noticed that the writer of the book, I thought they were just paying like deference to the fact that like he created the story. But
no. In fact, there was a lot of controversy behind the scenes. People mad that it was the whole blacklisting controversy, which was a big deal. But the frustrating thing of the guy who, in fairness, wrote the book but didn't touch the screenplay and didn't even speak English, being the one who is announced as the winner of the best screenplay, whereas the actual writers of the screenplay just don't even get acknowledged. I mean, a lot of people felt like that's bullshit, and we're right to feel that way, in my opinion. But of course, that was, we could, I'm not a historian to talk with really expertise about the blacklisting whole phenomenon, but there was a lot of BS occurring at that time period for that reason.
I think historians would agree with you.
I summed it up perfectly. But yeah, so it won a bunch of awards, including the score, which just ties into something we haven't really acknowledged, but what I think is probably arguable.
That my dog loves the score.
I was just going to mention the iconic quality of the moment of the British soldiers marching in, whistling the melody. I believe is called the Colonel Bogey March, but it's the and I think everyone knows that. So the yeah. If you're listening to this audio,
it's a video of my dog listening to the Colonel Bogey March.
Yep. But
he was super into it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see how that was. See, they just threw that in for dog appeal.
How many mediums were we just going through right there with me with my phone, with my dog on a video that I took, watching a movie on not Skype, but Google Hangout.
Live stream of a Google Hangout that is going to be a YouTube video and an audio podcast. Yeah. But just the British soldiers marching to that and whistling to that song, I feel is like, to my mind, I think that's arguably as iconic, if not more, than the actual shot of the bridge blowing up.
The two most memorable scenes in this movie are that and Nicholson falling on the plunger because he's been shot, and not necessarily the bridge blowing up, but him falling on the detonation to blow it up. I think in my mind, those are the two most iconic scenes.
Well, I think if you want to talk about a scene as opposed to kind of just an image, because that one, my only argument there is just that
images in my head, like those. Yeah. That's what I think of when I think of the movie: is the entering of the British soldiers and Nicholson, falling on the plunger. Like those are the images in my head.
Interesting. Well, because I would have thought that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not arguing. I guess I feel like that one is interesting only in the context of what we know about it. It's not necessarily a super interesting visual devoid of the story context.
Well, now we go back to, we do have to bring back the fact that I started watching this movie when I was 8 years old.
True.
That scene is very powerful for an 8-year-old.
Yeah, I can see that.
And it comes with the story context. So you can never devoid it from that when you have it put into your head like that young.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
Because you could say to me like, oh, well, yeah, is that really that cool of an image without story? I'd be like, yeah. But the reality is, because that story context of that scene is so deeply embedded of 30 years of having watched this movie, that's just part of me now.
Well, and arguably, if we're talking about iconic movie moments anyway, you could get into a whole thing of like, well, how much are you supposed to be divorcing the scene from the context in that sort of a question? I mean, I feel like the reason that I sort of default to thinking of the arrival of the British soldiers whistling is partly just because I feel like I've seen it referenced in so many cases where it's intended to evoke the imagery and the sound without necessarily trying to make it any more than that. Like in particular, I'm thinking of The Parent Trap, the Disney live action movie from, I think, what was that? Probably the 60s or something like that, where the at the summer camp, the two girls are forced to march and whistle that song. That's, I think, what comes to my mind, but maybe that's partly because I saw that movie before this one.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important because it sets the stage for everything that's to come. It's like it shows us that those soldiers are willing to operate under the direction, even under duress, like that order will maintain. It gives credibility to Nicholson's argument that we'll be able to, maintain this order, like, because, that is, it's a complex argument to say, like, oh yeah, well, if the officers don't have to work, like, then everybody will work harder. Like, as you pointed out, on the face of it, it's like, how does that work? Like, the officers just don't have to work, and that's going to make everybody else happy.
Mm-hmm.
But that scene lends the credibility, and you're like, oh, well, they're all. What are you doing, bud?
Well, yeah, I mean, the way
their default is to order and to, working in, even after they've been captured, they're whistling happily. They can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what he's doing. Hold on.
So apparently there was an original intent that instead of just whistling that song, that there are, I believe there may have been original lyrics, but there was a parody version where the lyrics were Hitler has only got one ball. And that was originally the idea was they were going to be singing that, but the decision was made to just have them whistle instead, which I think is definitely the right call.
Is that a IMDb trivia?
Yes.
See, I feel like my understanding of it is different than that, in that the march as a whistle originated first, and that the sort of limericky type lyric was given to it afterwards. Well, which is very, very common.
But what I'm saying is, when the movie was made in 1957, they originally were talking about having the soldiers sing the lyrics instead of whistle. So maybe during actual...
I mean, I don't know, but that feels...
Well, they didn't decide to do it. That's what I'm saying, is that I think it was the right decision to not have them do that.
I feel like it might have been a topic of conversation of, there are two ways to do this song. Which one do we want to go? I can't believe that was ever like, but maybe.
Well, all I'm saying is that
I'm not saying you were the one doing that. I'm just like, I would be shocked if like that was actually like a serious like consideration.
Well, what I think we're talking about too, though, is the difference between something that might have been in an early version of the script that got nixed during production.
Fair.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that it was apparently I thought that was interesting trivia because I didn't even know there were lyrics to it at all.
Oh yeah. Well, again, they're not the lyrics of the song. They're lyrics that were written to that tune.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know. I'm just saying. The original song, according to Wikipedia, was written in 1914 by F.J. Ricketts. All I'm trying to say is that there was a piece of trivia that said that they considered doing the lyric version. I feel like you're arguing me over nothing.
I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm arguing with the IMDb trivia You just happen to be the messenger, unfortunately.
Well, but on what basis do you have to question that was considered at some point in production? Like, I don't.
Well, so I think it was more of the point that it was presented as the original lyrics of the song were, but yet the song.
Okay, that's not what I said. That is not what I said. I said there's an original version of the song, and there was also a parody version that had the lyrics that went that way. And there was a discussion of having them sing those parody lyrics instead of whistling, and they decided not to do that. I never said that those were the original lyrics.
I felt like that's what you said.
Okay, now we're arguing about what you thought I said, so let's stop.
Well, yeah, no. So, but that's important, because if what you originally said was that, then I can understand now why you're upset that we're arguing, because you didn't feel like I'm arguing something that you didn't say.
Right.
Right.
So let's be clear. Those were not the original lyrics. It was a melody that predated any of that stuff, much less Hitler. And so later, people came up with parody lyrics. And according to IMDb trivia, there was a discussion of having the British soldiers sing those parody lyrics instead of whistling, which I'm glad they didn't do. That was the sum total of my whole point.
While it is likely my fault that we didn't start this way, we end 100% in agreement.
Okay, good then. All right. But yeah, the Breakfast Club, also a notable movie that uses that song in it in a deliberate attempt to evoke this movie, I think.
Unity amongst prisoners. Yep.
So, do you have anything else that you want to cover about Bridge on the River Kwai before we move on to the next movie?
No, if anybody's listening and or watching, and I just want to make sure you understand, I really like this movie. And I've liked this movie for 30 years. And I'm passionate about why it's a great movie. Yeah. And I was so excited to watch this movie again as a part of this and share it with my dog, even though he really only cared about the whistling. But no, it's a phenomenal movie.
Oh, it's great. 100% agreement there. So that said, let's move on now to number 35 on the list, Annie Hall, the 1977 Woody Allen movie, also starring Diane Keaton, considered by many to be Woody Allen's best film, certainly the only one on the list here. You had not seen it before, so what did you think?
This movie started, it didn't grab me when it first started. I was, for the first, like, even 20, 30, 45 minutes, I'm like, okay, it's interesting, it's decent, but I don't get why it's on this list. And then
that dinging is coming through on the audio.
Yeah, it's my work computer is tied to my iPhone, so I don't even know how to stop that without turning off the sound. So somebody decided to start lighting up a group chat.
Okay.
So I can figure out how to disconnect my.
All right.
Do you know how to get your iPhone off of your Mac? You probably don't.
No. Can you could turn it on to airplane mode or something?
I could, yeah. Then it would just stop. Yeah. How do I stop getting iMessages to my Mac? Disable.
All right. Well, so while we're waiting through these technical difficulties, let's talk about the awards that Annie Hall won.
Turning my phone off is quicker.
What?
Right.
All right.
Turning my phone off is quicker than following those directions. So anyway, for the first one, I'm trying to figure out why this movie's on. I'm like, yeah, this is an entertaining movie. Like, it's touching, it's funny, but I don't get why it's at that level. And then by the end of it, I started to figure out that this movie is essentially, yes, it's told through a neurotic New Yorker, but this movie is essentially like our own id, maybe. Like it's meant to be about us. Like it becomes a very generic, even though it has its own story. It's very generic. It allows you to kind of put your own life experiences against the characters, but told in this certain way.
Yeah, maybe universal rather than generic.
Universal. Yeah,
just for connotation's sake.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, part of what's interesting about it is that in many respects, I think the first half, maybe up until the part where it wasn't necessarily grabbing you, it feels in a lot of ways kind of like a Seinfeld prototype in some ways.
Yeah, it's just a whiny New Yorker going through life and like experiencing things.
Yeah, and making sort of stand-up comedy style observations about everything he's encountering in various ways, and just half of the movie is him monologuing about various things in a very sort of way that feels familiar, comparing it to the Seinfeld TV show. But then it eventually starts being a little bit more about something and less about setting the scene. But I think part of what I think it's great in terms of the character story and the universal nature of dealing with relationships and being difficult in that regard and all of that piece of it. But I mean, I think a big part of what keeps it notable on a list like this is just how indulgent it is in terms of style, and forcing you to question the idea of style over substance, but then kind of turning that question around on you and saying, well, but sometimes style is the only substance we have. And,
yeah.
And so the movie has a lot of sort of really fancy little tricks where, Alvy, Woody Allen's character, turning and monologuing to the camera, breaking the fourth wall, a bit like they're in the line at movie theater, and he's complaining about the guy who's being really pretentious and loudly patronizing his girlfriend about movies in the line behind him, and that being really annoying. And it feels again like something that could be a Seinfeld bit.
Yes.
But then what happens is he finally, it's the last straw, and says, what are you talking about? You don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan. And the guy says, oh yeah, well, I'm a professor, I should know. And it's like, oh yeah, well, how about I go bring Marshall McLuhan? And he steps out of the scene and goes and brings Marshall McLuhan on camera and has him confront the guy in an obviously like surreal meta narrative thing, but also a bit of like wish fulfillment of how often would you just love to just prove that obnoxious guy unequivocally wrong. Just that wish fulfillment fantasy element of it, but just the surreality and meta quality of that too. And I wasn't necessarily familiar with this, actually. I looked it up because I was curious, just as like, who is Marshall McLuhan? What is his deal? And it is actually very in keeping with the whole nature of this discussion, because Marshall McLuhan is apparently the guy who coins the term, the medium is the message. And specifically talking about things in context like with movies and TV, of how it's difficult for movies to have a discussion on a subject without choosing a side, because the nature of the medium inherently forces you to take a position just by virtue of what things you show. And it's kind of like the question the idea of, can you really make an anti-war film, or does the idea of making a war film inherently glorify the subject matter? Right? Like that kind of question. Apparently that was a lot of the sort of stuff that he talked about. A lot of other things too, but that being one of the foremost things that he was known for. So having him be the guy who comes on camera in a meta way to say unequivocally, no, you are wrong, is kind of this weird 3-layer deep meta joke that nobody's going to get unless they look it up on the internet later, which is kind of weird. It's a weird choice, and yet it works even when you don't know any of that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was also the scene that started to kind of turn me into the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and why I made the comment that part of it almost feels like, like I even said, like your own id, because it's like the things that you wish you could do,
Mm-hmm.
like that, like silence that guy by doing that, and by even just the conversations that he has with Annie, like he's just so like raw and like direct in a way that you probably wouldn't normally be in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And you're rooting for it to work out because you want that style of like communication to work, and then it doesn't. But then you still get this like play to you later where he like writes it into his play, that it all works out, and you're like, you get some sort of fulfillment out of that, like.
Yeah.
And that's sort of that's where I see the real power of the movie is. Not only is it a good movie, a cool relationship story, but it just taps into this thing using that breaking of the fourth wall, that using that meta stuff of drawing you in and kind of connecting you to those characters,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, don't you wish you could just say these things and do these things and have them work out okay? But they actually don't. If you behave like that, talk like that, act like that, make those
Mm-hmm.
decisions, they don't actually usually work out for you.
Right.
But you should still keep trucking forward. Like that's kind of the positive message at the end.
Well, I feel like it's almost not even so much like that you should, as much as like, well, what else are you going to do?
Yeah, what else are you going to do? Like, yeah.
You need the eggs, to put it the way he does in the movie.
Yeah.
The in particular the bit about him writing that sort of last conversation into the play but changing the outcome of it. I think my favorite bit of that scene is when we watch what is so obviously a very transparent, fan fiction wish fulfillment thing that he has just written, and Alvy, the character, turns to us, the audience, and kind of says, "What do you want from me? It's my first play." I just love that he's like acknowledging, okay, yes, you are 100% right, that it's very transparent of me and it's not very mature, and I totally understand what's happening here psychologically, but I had to work through it and just cut me some slack. But I think what becomes interesting in this is being partly about Alvy as a character being almost certainly very autobiographical with Woody Allen himself and a lot of people, where you have this element, your impulse is to make jokes about everything, and how that can be very superficially charming and a way to make friends with people or not, as you choose, to basically be the person who chooses whether or not you make friends with someone. Like if you decide you don't like that person, then you make jokes against them, and otherwise you make self-deprecating jokes, and then to brings people in, and this idea that it can be charming and appealing, but that it's hard to live with because you can't shut it off. You can't ever really take something seriously, and when you try, it tends to go badly because your impulse is to give everything that last little twist that is unexpected and people can't process, and you tend to not say how you really feel about things.
Right.
And so having it be character study of that, where it's this recognition of it, just like with the bit of the play, it's like I can take a step outside myself and see what I'm doing and how it's a problem. But recognizing it is such a long way from being able to stop doing it that I'm not sure it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's actually, I hadn't considered that message, but that is a very universal message of, because everyone has things that we're recognized, and we're like, I wish I could do this or stop doing that, and I wish I had done this in that situation, or I wish I had said that, or that she had responded in such a way. But that's like not how it happened.
Right.
And it's not how it continues to happen, you know?
Well, like a good example, I think, is the scene where it's another one of the movie's kind of meta tricks where they're on vacation or something, him and Annie, and it seems like, oh, they're having a great time. Now they're going to have sex, and it's all very romantic, and they're having fun and are on vacation. And then she's going to go smoke some grass before they have sex. And then he starts getting into his head about like, well, how come you always need to, do that? It makes me feel like I'm not good enough if you don't have grass too. So maybe you shouldn't do it. And that's putting her in a position of like, well, that helps me relax and makes it more fun for me. But now you don't want me to do it. And so, okay, fine, I guess I'll do it without because that's what you want. But now I'm not into it. And then he's in his head about, well, okay, now she's not into it. Does that mean that like she's only into it when she has grass? And he knows in his head as this is happening how unhelpful this whole line of conversation is. And he can't make himself stop. And then we actually see her visually check out of her body and go and start reading a book. Like her spirit is totally somewhere else. And she has this conversation with him. Like he can tell that, like, you're not even here. And she's like, oh, come on, you have my body. It's fine. It's fine. And just this recognition between them of this is not fine. And yet neither of them seems to be able to cross that gap.
Yeah. And you know what? When you look at scenes like that, I don't disagree with your Seinfeld comparison. It's just done to a different ends. Mm-hmm. The idea of it, of kind of snarkily like observing like all of these very realistic and sometimes uncomfortable like things that happen between people, is very Seinfeld. Mm-hmm. This is just done on a specific relationship level, with a little bit more emotion tied to it. So it's not an incorrect comparison. It's also why Seinfeld was very popular and why this movie.
Right, yeah.
It's hinting at things that, these are universal themes of things that people run into. Like it's not, it's not the, oh, well, you have to smoke grass before you have sex, but there's like, as relationships develop, like there's complexity to the intimacy part of it. Mm-hmm. As people have insecurities or habits and things like that. And, it's a humorous take on that. That's something it's uncomfortable to talk about because it's not a thing we all really want to talk about. Right. It's just a normal thing, and that's what made this movie so interesting when you actually like look at it, you finish it and you look back on it, you're like, wow, that was actually really quite a clever and funny and sad take on just normal human interactions. Mm-hmm. That are not necessarily always dealt with. And particularly in 1977, like those were not things that were like put out for public consumption, like, how people interact on these different stages. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bud? It was, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, so we have, all of the cinematic tricks, which I think are great because they convey in the language of cinema a similar effect to the interpersonal quality of you got to find a way to make everything into a joke. This idea of, we have all of the ironic, sarcastic sides to everything, and doing that with cinema instead of just filming someone doing it verbally.
Right.
And so the idea of him telling, like, for example, when in real life someone decides to tell a story about themselves as a kid, there will frequently not be a tight POV in their brain as a kid. It'll include these little asides of like, well, and of course now I know that this kid went on to become an accountant or something like that, right? So they build that into the cinema where that we see adult Alvy there in a classroom with this flashback version of the kids, and him having his adult brain thoughts about what happened then that he surely wouldn't have had then, which is like, observing how as a kid he was a little precocious in terms of running and kissing a girl classmate and getting scolded by the teacher. And then we see adult Alvy saying, I had a healthy curiosity. And on video we have a cute dog that is probably not being seen on the video because because I was the one talking.
So if I talk, Mowgli, talk, speak. No, go away. All right. Let's get back to business.
But yeah, just using all of those interesting tools of cinema, using them in ways that they aren't usually used, breaking the fourth wall and having these various cuts. And for example, having a flashback scene, but putting the contemporary version of the character in the flashback in a way that wouldn't have been, but in order to kind of make the sarcastic aside that someone might actually do when telling a story verbally.
Yep.
And it's in some ways it's a little bit like, it reminds me a little bit of Princess Bride, actually, in that sense of just the various bits of cutting back and forth between the story and the commentary on the story. But it's also interesting in terms of structure because we open the movie with the knowledge that him and Annie have broken up and that he's not feeling very good about it. And so we know that they broke up before we see them even meet. And so having the story framed that way is interesting too.
It is, because it makes the fact that they don't get back together even more powerful, because like the way that you expect it is like, oh, he's going to tell us they're broken up. Then we're going to get the whole origin story through the breakup and then have the reconciliation. It's going to be so happy. But because you're waiting for that reconciliation from the opening scene and it never happens, it's that much more powerful that it never happens.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at least for me, like that's what I heard when he was like, Annie and I aren't together anymore. Let me tell you the story about how we got together.
Mm-hmm.
I immediately think, okay, we're going to watch this whole story and see how that leads to the reconciliation from the opening of the movie. And so when it closes and it doesn't happen, it's like that feels more real, more, and that's a lot of what this movie does. Like, it's so realistic, even while using, all of those, things that are hyper realistic.
Mm-hmm.
The emotions it gives you are very realistic. Yeah,
it's yeah, I mean, I think it's just fascinating how like the all the little tricks of the filmmaking tie into that same idea of
I need a charger.
We have the same idea that we have these universal human emotions that are often so painful that our impulse is to turn away from them and to make some sort of a sarcastic joke about it or self-deprecating or whatever, and understanding that a lot of people have that impulse, and to have a story that kind of acknowledges that piece of it. So to talk about the painful things while including the impulse and a recognition of how sometimes turning away from it is what causes it to happen in the first place, and then demonstrating that through the medium as well as the story being communicated. and it's just super cool. I like it a lot. I think the I just totally lost my train of thought there. I think that the movie has a lot of, really iconic or, classic lines and bits that, just little turns of phrase that really entered the common vocabulary, including, you know nothing of my work. And spider as big as a Buick, that sort of thing. But one of the things I know, this is what I was going to talk about earlier, is the character of Annie Hall, as a counterpoint to Alvy's neurotic type that we've already sort of psychoanalyzed a little bit in the same way that he does in the movie. But her character walking that line between seeming so refreshing and free-spirited and full of energy on the one hand, artistic and all of that, but how easy that is to cross the line into flighty and insecure, and how those can kind of be two sides of the same coin in some senses, and how the same things that make you feel drawn to someone can be what ultimately turns you away. So like in the same respect that he struggles with her on the one hand, or like he's attracted to how much she doesn't seem to worry about anything. She just kind of does whatever she feels like in the moment. It's so spontaneous and interesting. And then, and he wants to encourage all of these dreams, but then the moment she starts actually doing the things instead of just talking about them, starts feeling threatening, because he tends to be a person who just talks about things and doesn't do them. And she has kind of the opposite response of like, you keep saying you're supporting me taking these adult education classes, and now the instant I do, you don't like them anymore. And there's a great sequence that kind of cuts back and forth between him encouraging her to take a class and then saying the same class is stupid. But I'm just one of the scenes in particular that I think really highlights her as a character, that I think's a really interesting performance from Diane Keaton, is the scene where he just asks some relatively simple question about her family, which she hasn't talked about very much yet. And she starts off telling one anecdote that veers hard left into another anecdote that seems funny until it's about her uncle dying at the supermarket. And you can see her. It's a little bit like we were saying, of like the idea of you can see what you're doing but can't make yourself stop. You can see her sort of realizing she's veering into a very different kind of story than she intended to tell at the start, and yet she's got so much momentum that she can't quite make herself turn away from that. And so she's telling this horrible story, but there's this exhilaration, and it's like, but yeah, isn't it kind of funny that he's just, oh no, and I just lost Mike. He just dropped out of the call. That's a shame. But the idea of having this character be someone who isn't sarcastic in the way Alvy is, because he recognizes in himself that even though it's something he sometimes likes about himself, he recognizes how it causes problems. And so here's someone who's not like that, which is simultaneously appealing because it's different from his own self-loathing, but also makes it harder for him to actually understand and comprehend. Well, hopefully I'm going to be able to get Mike back in the call here. But in the meantime, I mentioned bringing up the awards earlier. So let's talk about that now. This received the awards in 1978. Woody Allen himself was nominated but didn't win Best Actor in a Leading Role. But the movie did win Best Writing Original Screenplay. It won Best Director for Woody Allen. It won Best Actress in a Leading Role for Diane Keaton. And it won Best Picture. But one of the things that's interesting about it having won Best Picture is that it actually beat Star Wars that year, which is an interesting question to determine whether or not it was worthy of that. I think it's a great movie, but Star Wars, right? So I'm having to vamp a little bit while I see if I can get Mike back on. And my poor little dog is up to something over in the corner. Okay, so trying to text Mike. Hopefully we can get him back. So I think that Annie Hall, in some ways, you could kind of see it as a stand-in for all of Woody Allen's work, but what's certainly interesting about his work is how, like relatively few directors, he is someone whose body of work really feels distinct from cinema at large. Mike says, okay, he has the wrong computer charger. Let's see. Okay, so apparently he's got a computer charger problem. We'll see if we can get him back. Otherwise, we'll have to maybe cut this part short and revisit it, addressing the list in a little bit. But to finish the point that I was just making there, I think Woody Allen's filmography, you can tell there's a sensibility to it that feels distinct from other filmmakers. I think it's worth mentioning that Woody Allen as a human being is got some complexities about him. He has certainly done some things that are people take different opinions about, like how serious or how bad they are. I don't want to take a strong position on that because, to be honest, I don't know. I haven't really studied it too carefully. I don't know all of the details about what it is exactly that he's been accused of. I know some of it, of course. So I'm going to keep trying to bring Mike back in. But it's perhaps worth talking about the question related to this of how much can you separate the filmmaker from the filmmaking, especially when often the films in question are very autobiographical, like these are. Trying to get Mike back on because me doing this by myself is not optimal. Oh, hopefully we got Mike back. Are you back? You're joining? We're waiting for it to connect all the way, and it's hopefully soon. We've got just a helpful little profile pic of Mike in a suit, and hopefully he's connecting, and it will be along soon, and everyone can stop listening to me try to vamp. Oh, there you are. We got you. Can you hear me? Maybe not yet. Still processing. I see you. I don't know what's happening, but hopefully we've got you soon. But the question of whether or not you can entirely separate a filmmaker from their own work is not something that's unique to Woody Allen, but is relevant when we talk about some of his iconic work. And I think that for the purposes of this discussion, we'll probably keep it more or less separate while at the same time acknowledging that it is a completely valid perspective to say that you shouldn't separate those those things, and that you know, should always keep that sort of thing in mind. Are you able to hear me now, Mike? No, I guess not. We see you on camera, but you apparently don't hear me. So I have a significant bit of stuff to cut out of this episode for the audio version. Either that or I just won't do it, and all of this vamping will be in there. But you guys know how that works, and the mic has just dropped out again. Okay, so are you back? Can you hear me now?
Yes. God.
Okay, because you were on there for a little bit, but didn't seem to be able to hear me. And we're fiddling around. So, but I'm glad to see you back now. I was just talking in my increasingly desperate vamping to. That's all right. About the technical stuff happens. But addressing the question of, given that Woody Allen as a human being, as opposed to a filmmaker, has certainly done some controversial things that a lot of people disapprove of, and I am only refraining from a more specific judgment because honestly, I really don't know all the details, and so don't feel qualified to speak on them per se. But the question,
girl or something, I think was like part of it.
Right, like there was some like an adopted daughter or something that he eventually divorced his wife to marry, but I don't really know the details, so I kind of was going to skirt that as much as just to say it's certainly true that people have suggested that he is not a nice guy and has done some things that are not cool. But the question then being, how much do you think that a filmmaker like Woody Allen, who makes a lot of autobiographical types of films, how much do you try to separate the filmmaker from the film in that sort of a situation?
I mean, it's tricky. And we're probably going to have this conversation again, right? Is Chinatown on here?
I think it is. Actually, I don't think it is. Oh, no, there it is. It's at 21. Yep.
Yeah. So here in 5 years, we'll have to.
Yeah.
We'll have that conversation again. But your question was different, I guess, than the Chinatown one. I mean, I think that there are two pieces to that. Like, can you divorce them from the film and their work in general? And when they make autobiographical works, is that more difficult? Like, I feel like that's your question is a little bit multi-layered in that.
Yeah, because while Chinatown, Chinatown is not about who the director is as a person, whereas Annie Hall in a lot of ways kind of is. It's all about his worldview and sort of examining his own feelings and sensibilities. It's loosely based on his own relationship with Diane Keaton, is my understanding.
Which would make sense,
Yeah. It's kind of weird to the idea that you have an ex and you specifically say, how about you and I work together to make a movie about how our relationship crashed and burned?
I mean, if they truly are friends the way that the movie ends, then
yeah,
I think she would be more than willing to do that. But yeah, I don't know. That's tricky. Like, because it comes back to you look at the Cosby Show, which is, it's not autobiographical, but it's kind of meant to be. It's about Bill Cosby's hypothetical family if he was a doctor. But it's him.
Yeah.
And then he is gone. You learn all these things about him, and it's like, can you really go back and watch that and just enjoy it? And it does make it a little more difficult. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't hold any of those things watching this movie, but you bringing it up makes me feel like I should have.
That's
not that you were trying to do it that way, but
I think it's a valid question to think about, but I don't necessarily think that requires the answer be, you're not allowed to like this movie because of that. I don't think that is the right feeling. You know what I mean? I think it's completely fair for anyone to feel like they can't enjoy this movie because of what he did. But I think that is, I don't want to say it's like a personal decision, but I think it's a matter of some people are not going to feel able to separate the two. And, but I don't think that means that they cannot be separated. But then again, maybe the question can always be somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? It is a relevant subject to talk about, and thus you are not completely separating it, but you also don't necessarily have to let that permeate every aspect of it.
Yeah. And also, this movie was made prior to those things happening, so it's like it wasn't made from that space. Yes, the guy who did those things eventually became that guy, but it wasn't made from that space, I guess. You know?
Yeah. Well, and even still, I think it's you know, if you wanted to try to go down the road of saying anyone who creates any art has to also be a paragon of humanity, you're going to run into trouble really quick. Yeah. So I think that there can be, at the same time that I think it is fair to question whether or not the artist is a nice guy, I think it's also probably a mistake to insist that anyone who creates art must also be placed on some sort of a pedestal, and if they fall off of it, you can't enjoy their art anymore.
Right.
Your camera keeps turning on and off.
I know, something's happening here.
Okay. So one of the things that I was talking about a little bit when you got cut off initially was Diane Keaton's performance in this, and her character being just how interesting her character is, but also a reflection of like her outfits were weird, but strongly influenced fashion after the movie came out, because they were weird, but people said, that's cool weird. I like that. And it, you know, wanted to dress like her. But also just her character, I feel like we don't, in some ways, it's like the prototype for the cliche of the manic pixie dream girl. Okay, now I'm hearing an echo of myself. Oh, okay, stop. Okay, so the cliche of the manic pixie dream girl, which has entered, I think, public consciousness in the last 10 years or so, in some ways she is like a prototype of what grew into that, and yet I think she is internally not that, because her character is like a pre-deconstruction of that idea. You know, where the idea becomes a cliche is only when it takes the fun part of that and ignores the darker part, as opposed to this, which is always included all the complexity. Are you following any of that, or I know you were dealing with stuff, so I don't want to.
No, I'm following the concept. I'm not as familiar with the Pixie Dream Girl.
Okay, this is the idea of the manic pixie dream girl is the idea of, as a trope, objectified, cliche, flat character type for any story in which you have the stuffy guy who's afraid to express himself, and he meets the girl who's weird, and maybe she has dyed hair, and she likes funny music, and she just seems so spontaneous, and she brings him out of his shell. But the idea of a story where that's really all there is to the character is her being kind of weird and silly, and that's what she's like a prop to help the male character experience his own personal growth. Which certainly there are lots of examples of that in fiction, and I think of late the name of the trope has come from people deconstructing that idea. You know, it was never something that someone called their character that on purpose as a positive thing. It was more a matter of people recognizing the growth of that character type. We're starting to say, let's give a name to that because it's a thing, and having that become, starting to deconstruct it. But I feel like whereas Annie in this movie has some qualities to that, it's like she includes the deconstruction part along with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. She does, because I was trying to think, is just make sure that I feel confident, like that her personality transcends all of that, and it does. You know, she does have motivations and interests and things that are outside of that. Well, you know, she enters the scene, we feel like she's somewhat vapid and kind of silly, and she continues to be kind of silly the whole time, but she does develop, you know, as on screen, like some very sophisticated desires and motivations. The only part that I would think that maybe, you know, I don't think it's in, or maybe it was intended to kind of take away her character motivation, was the part where at the end, you know, he makes this huge thing about we should get back together. You need to move back to New York City. That's where you belong. Like, makes this statement of like why we need to get back together. And she says, I don't want to do that. You know, in that scene in the which eventually becomes like the scene that then turns into they get back together in the play. And then she does come back to New York City.
Well, later she visits with someone else.
No, she moved back to New York City. When he meets her again in New York City, she has moved back to New York City. She is with someone else, but she has moved back to New York City. And that part just gave me a little bit of pause, like not on her character, but on the movie's development of her character, to say, like, you made this whole big thing of like his stake in the ground was like, the reason we're not together is that you want to live in LA and I want to live in New York. And she says, no, yes, I want to live in LA. I want to do this stuff. I want to see this stuff through. And then he kind of dismissively is like, yeah, and then I saw Annie again a couple of years later, and she had moved back to New York, and she was with somebody else, and we were friendly. Well, and it's like, I didn't get that.
See, I want to dispute with you a little bit on what she is justifying. I don't think she was putting a stake in the ground, saying, in the sense of saying, I have decided that LA is the place for me and I'm going to stay here forever. I think what she was rightfully doing is telling him, you flew all the way out here to make an ultimatum and nobody asked you to do that. I don't want to get back together with you. I don't know if I'm going to be in LA forever, but I do know that I want to be in LA right now. And just because you came out to try to make a gesture doesn't mean I'm going to get back together with you.
Yes, thank you. That's a good point of it. Like, because I was saying that was the part I was having trouble reconciling, is that, you know, that scene felt to me like it was the division became between LA and New York.
Well, I think that's what he was trying to make it, is that,
which is exactly right, which is why, like, I kind of took it that way, which I'm glad that you illustrated that wasn't exactly what it was. It was what he had decided it was about, not what it was really about, which now makes that end scene even more powerful as opposed to dismissive in my mind, is that she gets to do whatever she wants
Mm-hmm.
because it wasn't about location. It was about their state in life,
Mm-hmm.
and that they were going in two different directions. And he made it about LA versus New York, and she made it about, you want to go this way, I want to go that way. And so while she chose to come back to New York, that doesn't mean they automatically get back together.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when I originally watched it through, it felt like, oh, well, we made this whole thing, and I said you needed to move back to New York, and you said you didn't want to, and then you did anyway. So, like, I was kind of right, even though we're not together. That's kind of how I originally took it, but
Yeah.
I like your take on it a lot better. You know?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think that the part of maybe what I had in my head thinking about it is some online discussions I saw recently, because apparently there was a news story about, you know, like a local human interest sort of news thing where some guy got dumped by his girlfriend, and so he he took a piano into a park somewhere, and like the whole gimmick was that he was just going to sit there and play piano in the park until she got back together with him. And a couple of articles reported on that, like, oh, isn't this some romantic gesture? And I saw a lot of women online going, no, that's not romantic. That is a guy who got dumped, who is doing creepy, desperate, like stalker things to put pressure on her to get back together with someone that she dumped. Like, that's not romantic. That is him unable to take no for an answer when that's a problem. And it's just an idea of how a lot of romance movies in Hollywood and everything have kind of sold a lot of people for a long time on the idea that, you know, usually it's portrayed as a guy getting told no, and all he has to do is just be persistent enough, and eventually that she'll accept him. And doing increasingly desperate, creepy, stalker-like things is portrayed as romantic in the movies, when in real life it's not so much.
Yes, and it reminds me of two movies that are interrelated because of their main character that I feel like the second movie is making the joke on the first one. So you have John Cusack and, oh God, why can't I remember the movie? The one with where he's holding the
Say Anything?
Say Anything, yes. You have Say Anything. Yeah, where he shows up and he holds the boombox over his head, and that's essentially the playing of the piano and being desperate. Mm-hmm. And in that movie, because of the way that they broke up and the way that it was the 80s, like, it was very endearing. Mm-hmm. And then you get to High Fidelity, and, you know, his character, like, I feel like they're supposed to be tied together. Yeah, he doesn't do the boombox thing, but he shows up outside of his ex-girlfriend's, like, apartment, mm-hmm. watching her, and he decides to call her on the phone, and it ends up being like this horrible, like, almost like a prank call, and mm-hmm. it's so uncomfortable, and it's like he feels like the creepy stalker.
Right.
And I feel like even Cusack, like, even though he wasn't the director of those movies, was acknowledging the fact that, like,
was a good use of existing casting history.
Right. In the moment, the Say Anything mm-hmm. thing was endearing. Yeah. But in any other context, that is creepy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this, like, in the context of a movie, you can engineer situations where that feels justified within the context of that story. But the problem is that behavior does not transfer to real life well at all. And it kind of communicates the wrong message to a lot of people. And so in this context, I think what I had in my head, like, when he goes out to LA, is she's kind of like, nobody asked you to fly out here, so don't try to put that on me like, oh, you came all this way. You didn't even tell me you were coming until you called me on from the payphone at the airport. Like, I was supposed to come pick you up or something. You surprised me in the middle of my day and act like I'm supposed to drop everything and be impressed that you flew across the country without asking or telling me you were going to, or finding out if I was interested at all in what you were going to have to say. Like, what you know, it's not my job to be impressed with the creepy lengths that you're going to.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe because I had this other story in my head, I was just kind of really primed to see it from that perspective. But I think part of what's also going on with like her character is um, he kind of wants her to be this sort of manic pixie dream girl sort of situation, right? Like for example, what he likes about being with her, for one, is being the smart one, right? And that sets up her own insecurity of feeling like, does he think I'm dumb? He certainly thinks and is probably right that he's smarter than me. But what does that mean? Is he going to get bored with me? And so she starts the idea of like, well, maybe I'll go to adult education classes and I can become more and I can learn more things and all that. And he's really on board with that idea when it's his idea to suggest, oh, if you want to be smart like me, here's the things that you could do. But then when she starts to actually do it, he's threatened by it.
Yeah.
When she starts to actually take those classes, and the whole thing of like, oh, she wants to be a singer.
Develop a relationship with the professor. I mean,
yeah.
But again, you put the weight on why that happened on not just her. Like he did drive some of that, but
yeah,
he had a realistic insecurity.
Yeah. But the point is that he encouraged her to do something, and then when she does it, he discourages her again. He's looking for reasons to control her. And then also like the whole element of, isn't it cute and romantic that maybe she's a good singer, but she's nervous to sing in front of people. And then that first performance is just a nightmare for anyone who's done small shows, where it's kind of like just the constant restaurant noise and people talking over her singing and all of that sort of thing. And the idea that he gets to be the one who's a practiced professional and knows what he's doing with performing, and he's moderately successful at it. And so he gets to be the mentor, all like, oh, you did great, at the same time knowing that there's no way she's going to surpass him because she's okay. Maybe she's not really that great, but it's cute. But then as soon as there's like a record label who is like, oh no, I actually want to sign you, and hey, you want to come to this fancy party? It's like all of a sudden, oh wait, no, I can't control it then if in that situation. And again, I'm not putting it in a sinister context, like he's approaching it deliberately and consciously that way. But I think that's still the impulse that he's struggling with. And the movie depicts that in a way that shows that, that's part of the message being taught there, I think. Hey, Luna, come on.
Oh, yeah. Well, in the movie, at least unless I don't remember a particular scene, the movie also like plays on his neurosis with the record producer, who is Paul Simon, right?
Yeah, it's Paul Simon,
who is clearly like hitting on her.
Yeah,
and she continues to like speak affectionately towards him. They've broken up and all that, and so he's got this idea that like she's dating him or doing whatever with him, which may or may not be true. So it's like you get in this complexity of like towards him because he was helping her, and then Woody Allen created in his mind like something like deceptive about that. And again, it's why I went back to originally like why I felt like this was like sort of an id thing. It's like it's playing out to like all of our, because we can all see ourselves in Woody Allen's predicament, in Alfie's predicament, in that, this guy comes in, she wasn't doing that great, and now all of a sudden, he wants her coming to parties, he's got a ton of money, influence, power, she's gravitating towards him, moving to LA. You can see this jealousy like building and understand where it's coming from, even if there's actually nothing there. So I feel like it doesn't even matter if there was or wasn't something there, because the movie's about his reaction to their interaction, which is what you're talking about. He felt comfortable when she was like, he was supporting her in something that she wasn't very good at and wasn't ever going to like go do anything with. But then once that became successful, now all these other neuroses like come to play, and jealousies and all this other part of it, you know?
Yeah. Like he's got his own insecurity. Here, echo of myself again. That I don't know why that starts and stops. But he's got his insecurity that works against him whenever things are going well for her. So it kind of puts him in this position of, without really intending it to come across this way, he feels insecure when things are going well because he worries that if she's doing well, then she'll leave him because she'll be too good for him. So he kind of has this instinct of having to keep her from succeeding, because if she succeeds, she'll leave him. And it's coming from his own insecurity, but it expresses itself as being controlling, but with this edge of self-aware sarcasm. Whereas from her perspective, all she can really get is, you encouraged me to keep doing these shows. You encouraged me to follow my dreams. And now here's a record producer who wants to sign me, and you're pretending we have a thing so you don't have to go to a party? You know? And I think it's a really interesting, nuanced kind of take, and recognizing and seeing it clearly from both sides there. Just like, for example, the scene that feels like a split screen, but apparently was literally just a set with a divided wall, of the two of them having their respective conversations with their respective psychiatrists.
Yeah.
That was kind of fun. For example, like, how often are you having sex? And he says, hardly at all, maybe 3 times a week. And she says, constantly, maybe 3 times a week.
Yeah.
But that also actually reminds too of when they're talking about their various families, and we have an actual split screen of 2 completely different rooms, 2 completely different families, but having it set up where the 2 scenes are commenting on each other like they're actually all at the same table. That was kind of fun too.
That was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of what's clever about this film, is that it speaks to us universally. It talks very rawly about relationships in a way that probably wasn't, common in movies back in the 70s. It used not tropes, but, techniques that were different than normal storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
It was funny. It was endearing. But it also, it talked to a lot of psychiatry and that whole thing. That was all kind of a new thing in the 70s. So talking plainly about that was a big thing. So I see a lot of the reasons why the movie's on the list. I liked it, and I think it's a great movie. I'm definitely moving it down. But I see why culturally in the late 70s, this type of movie was such a big deal, and why it does still resonate, which is why it belongs on the list, but just maybe not up here for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. On that note, this is something I just briefly went into when I was vamping, but just for your own, sorry, I'm itching my shoulder. My own curiosity of your reaction is the idea that it did win Best Picture for the year that it came out, and it actually what it beat out was Star Wars. And so I think that's an interesting historical cinematic question to consider.
I'm not offended by that. For what this movie did to storytelling, in hindsight, when you look back at the universe of how Star Wars told the story, it is obviously much bigger. Mm-hmm. But in the microcosm of the late 70s, it was, it's a cool sci-fi movie with very, Greek, themes to it, which is cool. Very good. puts you on the Best Picture list. This was acknowledging things that were politically, because you have to remember the Academy is, whether they want to admit it or not, there's a politic to it.
Yeah.
This was doing things that were politically like, ooh, can you talk
more
about
highbrow?
Yeah, very highbrow also, but very much like, oh wow, look how he, broke the fourth wall and brought this guy in, and is speaking about like things that in the 50s, remember you're coming out of the 50s and 60s where relationships were all like painted on television and movies as, nuclear families. And he's got this very different take on it that he sort of excused via that it's, I'm a New Yorker. But he's really addressing everybody. Mm-hmm. And you can see how that just played to the type of people in the Academy who would be wanting a Best Picture. Like, this made sense, So I still think Star Wars is a better picture.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to dispute why it won.
I think you're 100% right in terms of why they chose it at the time. But I do think that although that this is a great movie, I think it's it's reflected on the AFI's list, which one has better stood the test of time, or not. That's not the right way to say it. Which was more influential over cinema as a whole, just by the fact that Annie Hall is respectable 35 on the list, but Star Wars is 13.
Right.
So yeah. But on that note, let's talk about the list. Where do we want to move these two movies? Have you got your own thoughts on that, or?
I know for a fact I'm leaving Bridge on the River Kwai where it is. Let me pull up the rest of the list. What about you?
I'm taking Annie Hall, and I'm moving it down between Rear Window and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the upper 50s. Bridge on the River Kwai, moving down not as far, but I think I'm going to put it between King Kong and Intolerance in the mid-40s.
Yeah, I'm going to leave Bridge on the River Kwai where it is.
Okay.
I'm going to take Annie Hall down. I'm going to put it after MASH, but before Bonnie and Clyde.
Okay.
So 54.
All right.
So still good, but
yeah. Whoops. Let's undo that. Okay, so let's see. MASH and Bonnie and Clyde. There we go. Moving stuff around on a spreadsheet. It makes for fascinating audio and for video that you guys can't see.
Is this not transmitted?
No. I have a way to do that, especially with all the stuff that I've figured out in terms of my D&D streams, but I don't have this broadcast set up to do that right now. All right, so Bridge on the River Kwai moves from 36 to 35 on your list, actually, because Annie Hall, which was ahead of it, got moved down, with Annie Hall ending up at 53, which is actually higher than I ended up putting it. I have it ended up at 57 on my list, and I moved Bridge on the River Kwai to number 43. So that moves our list along. So the next two movies that we would be talking about are number 34, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and number 33, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now there's a double feature for you.
Yep, very thematically similar.
Yeah. They both have an evil witch. Sort of.
Fair. Yeah, they do have that.
Yeah. But so we will hopefully not take quite as long in between episodes, but certainly I think our own track record does not lend itself well to making promises in that regard, but we'll see. In the meantime, thank you for listening and or watching, and watch good movies.
Watch movies.
Nice commitment there at the end. All right, good night, everybody.